Hannah Wills snatched the coffee out of Jake's hand, the coffee he had bought with his own money, and poured it straight into the trash without a single word. Just like that. Right in front of everyone. And Jake Myers stood there jaw tight, hands at his sides, and said nothing. But here's what Hannah Wills didn't know, what nobody in that building knew: the man she just humiliated in front of her entire staff was the only reason her company still existed at all. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. You're going to want to be here for all 5 parts of this one. The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., same as it did every morning. Jake Myers didn't groan, didn't hit snooze. He sat up in the dark, planted both feet on the cold hardwood floor, and let the silence of the apartment settle around him for exactly 30 seconds. It was the only quiet he'd get all day, and he'd learned to treat it like something sacred. He could hear Sophia breathing through the thin wall between their rooms. She was 12 now, and she still slept with the small nightlight shaped like a crescent moon that her mother had left behind. Jake hadn't had the heart to take it down. Probably never would. He moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light muscle memory, guiding him past the stack of bills on the counter, past Sophia's backpack hanging on the chair, past the photograph on the refrigerator, the 3 of them at the beach 6 years ago. Before everything fell apart. Before Laura got sick. Before the medical bills turned into a second mortgage. Before Jake Myers, who had once built the digital backbone of one of Chicago's fastest-growing tech companies, found himself behind the wheel of a black town car ferrying executives around the city for $11 an hour plus tips. He poured coffee into a thermos, checked his phone. One message from the dispatch app. His first pickup at 6:15, and looked once more at Sophia's closed door. "I'm doing this for you, baby girl," he thought. "Every single day, I'm doing this for you." Why you? He pulled up to the Wills Enterprises tower at 6:08. The building was one of those glass and steel monuments to ambition that lined the Michigan Avenue corridor, 42 floors, reflective windows that caught the sunrise and threw it back at you like a dare. Jake had been inside that building exactly once before 17 years ago, when it wasn't even called Wills Enterprises yet. Back then it was called Meridian Technologies, and Jake had been one of 12 people crammed into a converted loft space on the 3rd floor, surviving on vending machine sandwiches and the terrifying electric feeling that they were building something that mattered. He parked the car and checked the dispatch again. Hannah Wills, executive pickup, recurring contract. Jake had been driving Hannah Wills for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she had spoken directly to him exactly twice. Once to tell him the car smelled like someone's lunch it hadn't, and once to ask him to stop at a Starbucks on Wacker, where she'd handed him a 20 and told him to keep the change with the kind of generosity that made a person feel smaller, not larger. He stepped out and stood by the rear passenger door, hands clasped in front of him, collar straight. Hannah came through the revolving door at 6:19, 4 minutes late, already talking on her phone. She was 43, sharp-featured, the kind of woman who moved through a room like she owned the square footage beneath her feet. She wore a charcoal blazer and carried a leather portfolio tucked under her arm like a weapon. She walked straight past Jake without breaking stride, pulled open the car door. Herself, he was 2 steps away, still moving toward it, and dropped into the back seat. He got behind the wheel. "Ashland office," she said, still on the phone. He pulled into traffic. For the next 22 minutes, he listened to her dismantle someone on the other end of the call with the kind of precision that was almost admirable. She wasn't yelling. That was the thing. She never yelled. She just spoke in this measured, controlled tone that somehow communicated, "I am completely done with your excuses," more effectively than any raised voice could have. Jake kept his eyes on the road and thought about Sophia's science fair project, which was due Thursday, and whether they had poster board at home. They didn't. The incident happened on a Tuesday. Jake had been called up to the 31st floor, unusual, since drivers typically waited in the lobby, or the parking structure, because one of Hannah's senior aides, a nervous young man named Prescott, had told dispatch that Ms. Wills needed the car repositioned, and then someone had changed their mind, and now Jake was standing in the elevator lobby on 31, holding a dry cleaning bag that Prescott had shoved at him with a look of profound apology, waiting for further instructions. The floor was open-plan all-glass partitions and standing desks, and the particular kind of performative busyness that Jake recognized from his own past life. People moved fast and looked focused and barely noticed him. He noticed them. He noticed the whiteboard on the wall of the main conference room visible through the glass, covered in system architecture diagrams. And something in his chest went very, very still. He recognized those diagrams. Not similar, not reminiscent. He recognized them the way you recognize your own handwriting on a note you wrote 20 years ago and forgot about. The branching logic trees, the redundancy loops. The particular way the data routing was mapped with those small triangular annotation markers he'd developed himself, because the standard notation didn't capture what he needed it to. "Can I help you?" Jake turned. A young woman analyst maybe, or junior developer, was looking at him with the polite suspicion reserved for anyone who didn't belong on a floor. "Sorry," he said. "Wrong floor." He pressed the elevator button and didn't look back at the whiteboard. But his hands hanging at his sides with the dry cleaning bag were not entirely steady. That night after Sophia was asleep, Jake sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and spent 3 hours going through everything he could find about Wills Enterprises' recent public filings, tech announcements, and job postings. The job postings told him more than the press releases ever could. Senior Infrastructure Engineer, Legacy System Integration. Must have experience with distributed architecture and fault-tolerant design. Knowledge of proprietary systems A+. Systems architect urgent. Immediate availability required. Will consider unconventional candidates. Urgent. Immediate availability. Those were panic words dressed up in professional language. Jake closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. Rebecca called the next morning, which meant she'd somehow already heard something his sister had always had an inexplicable radar for the moments in his life when things were about to get complicated. "You're driving for Hannah Wills," she said before he could even say hello. "Good morning to you too, Becca." "Jake, you are driving the woman whose company runs on your code. Your code. The thing you built with your own 2 hands before they pushed you out and handed everything to Martin Greer, who couldn't find his way out of a for loop without a GPS. Martin's fine. Martin is a fraud, and you know it, and I know it, and I'm pretty sure on some level Martin knows it." He could hear her moving around her kitchen, the sound of cabinet doors. "Does she know? Does she know who you are?" "She knows my name is Jake, and that I take the Wacker Street exit to avoid the construction." "Jake." "I'm fine, Becca." "You are not fine. You haven't been fine since Laura died. You can say it." Silence on the line. "Since Laura died," he repeated, quieter now. "And I had to sell the condo and pull Sophia out of her school and take whatever work I could get while I figured out the next chapter. That's what happened. And this is the next chapter for right now. I'm not going to walk into Hannah Wills' office and announce myself like I'm owed something." "You are owed something." "Maybe. But Sophia needs her dad present and working and not getting into a fight with his employer over a past that's already done." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "The system's failing, Jake. I've heard things. People in my network are talking about it. Whatever they've been running on, it's not holding. And when it goes, and it will go, then they'll hire engineers to fix it. Engineers who don't know what you know." Her voice shifted softer now. "You built something beautiful, Jake. You built something that held up for almost 20 years. That's not nothing. That's not something you just walk away from." Jake looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. "I'll talk to you later, Becca," he said. He hung up and went to get Sophia up for school. The moment that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon. Jake was in the lobby waiting when it happened. He saw it from across the marble expanse, a young intern, maybe 19-20 years old, moving too fast, coffee in hand, laptop bag sliding off his shoulder. The coffee went first. The cup hit the floor and the lid came off, and a full 16 ounces of dark roast spread across the marble in a perfect radius, and the kid made a sound like someone had punched him and dropped to his knees, grabbing at nothing. Jake was moving before he thought about it. He crossed the lobby, crouched down, helped the kid gather the cup, used the small pack of napkins he always kept in his jacket pocket, old habit from a lifetime of being the one who cleaned things up, and said quietly, "It's okay. These things happen. You're not in trouble." The kid looked up at him with eyes that were dangerously close to actual tears. "I was supposed to bring that to her meeting, Ms. Wills is 10 o'clock. She's going to—" "Hey." Jake kept his voice level. "Go to the cafe cart on the second floor. They're faster than the coffee shop on the corner. Get there in 4 minutes, you'll still make the meeting. Go." The kid scrambled to his feet and went. Jake stood up, napkins in hand, and turned and found Hannah Wills 2 feet away from him. She hadn't stopped to help. She'd stopped because she'd nearly walked through the coffee puddle, and she was looking at Jake with an expression he recognized immediately because he'd spent years on the receiving end of it, the look of someone who sees a person and categorizes them in under a second as not particularly important. "Clean that up," she said, and walked away. Not to the cleaning staff. Not to no one in particular. To Jake, standing there in his driver's jacket, napkins already in hand. Clean that up. He stood very still for a moment. The thing was, he wasn't angry. Or rather, he was. But it was the old anger, the familiar kind. The one that had lived in his chest for so long, it had become structural. The anger of a man who had watched his name quietly disappear from the thing he'd created. The anger of watching Martin Greer take a bow at the company's 10th anniversary gala, while Jake Myers sat in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, calculating whether he could afford both the electric bill and Sophia's field trip. He threw the napkins away. He went back to his post by the door, and he thought about what Rebecca had said. When it goes, and it will go. He almost missed it. He was pulling the car around to the executive entrance the following Monday when he heard 2 people talking just outside the parking structure door, a man and a woman, voices low and clipped with the specific anxiety of people who are trying not to sound as panicked as they feel. "Greer says it's a legacy problem. Says the original architecture has a flaw in the load distribution. Greer said that 3 weeks ago. Nothing's changed. The Singapore expansion goes live in 40 days. And if the back end can't handle the traffic increase, I know what happens if it can't handle it. Then tell me why we're still sitting here talking about what Greer says instead of—" "Because nobody knows who built the original system. There's no documentation. Greer's been trying to reverse engineer it for 6 months and he's—" A pause. "He's not getting there." Jake sat in the car and did not move for a very long time. Nobody knows who built the original system. He thought about the bypass protocol he'd written in year 3. A fail-safe, a pressure valve he'd designed into the deepest layer of the architecture because he'd always known that someday the system would be pushed past what anyone expected of it. He'd written it at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, running on cold coffee, and the particular kind of focused anxiety that had always been his version of inspiration. He'd never told anyone about it. Not because he was trying to protect anything. Because by the time it was finished, the situation at the company had deteriorated to the point where he was being quietly managed out, and the last thing he'd wanted to do was hand them another piece of himself on the way out the door. The bypass existed. Hidden in plain sight, 2 levels below where any of Greer's engineers would think to look. A key that nobody knew the lock existed for. Jake started the car. 40 days. He pulled out of the parking structure and said nothing to anyone. But that night, he opened his old hard drive, the one in the fireproof box in the back of his closet, the one he hadn't opened in 4 years, and he found the file. It was still there. All of it. every line of it exactly as he'd left it. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the cursor blinking on the screen, and he thought about a lot of things. He thought about the morning he'd walked out of Meridian Technologies for the last time. Cardboard box in his hands. Martin Greer not meeting his eyes. He thought about Laura, who had squeezed his hand that night and said, "You'll build something even better. I know you will." He thought about Sophia asleep in the next room with her crescent moon nightlight and her science fair project and her whole life stretched out in front of her. He thought about Hannah Will's face when she said clean that up. He closed the laptop. Not yet. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. But he was sure of one thing when the moment came, and it was coming. He could feel it, the way you feel a storm when the air pressure changes. He was not going to be invisible anymore. He was done being invisible. He went to bed. The alarm was set for 4:47. The next 2 weeks, Jake watched. That was the thing most people never understood about being a driver. You became invisible in the way furniture was invisible. People forgot you were in the room. They forgot there was a human being behind the wheel. Someone with ears and memory and 20 years of systems architecture experience, sitting 3 feet away from their most sensitive conversations. Hannah Wills forgot constantly. On the Monday after he'd found the file, she took a call from someone named Donovan Legal, by the sound of it, and the conversation lasted the entire 40-minute drive to the Ashland office. Jake kept his eyes forward and heard everything. The Singapore timeline is non-negotiable, Donovan. Non-negotiable. That contract has penalty clauses that would make your hair turn white. Hannah. I understand that, but if the infrastructure team is saying there's a risk, every team says there's a risk. That's what teams do. They manage the risk, that's their job. My job is to make sure we hit the date. And if the system goes down during the live rollout? A pause. Just a breath. Jake caught her face in the rearview mirror, the tiniest flicker of something beneath the control. Gone in under a second. Then we deal with it, she said. But it won't. She ended the call. Jake said nothing. He took the exit ramp and thought about load distribution thresholds and the particular way cascading failures propagated through a poorly reinforced architecture, and he thought it will. Sophia asked him that evening why he looked tired. They were eating dinner pasta the 3rd time that week because it was cheap, and she never complained, and she had her chin in her hand watching him with those steady dark eyes that had come directly from Laura. Sophia had her mother's ability to see straight through whatever version of fine Jake was performing on any given night. Work stuff, he said. What kind of work stuff, like traffic? Something like that. She twirled her fork. Mrs. Patterson says that stress ages you prematurely. She said it in health class. Mrs. Patterson sounds very informed. She said men over 40 are especially susceptible. Jake looked up. I'm 44. I know. Sophia kept her expression perfectly neutral. Just saying. He laughed, actually laughed, the kind that came from somewhere real, and she grinned at him across the table, and for a minute the weight of everything lifted just enough for him to breathe. Dad, she said, quieter now. Yeah. Are we going to be okay? He put his fork down. He looked at his daughter, 12 years old, sharp as a tack, carrying more awareness of their situation than any kid her age should have to carry. And he said the way he always said it, not as a performance, but as a fact, he held on to with both hands. We are always going to be okay. She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded the way she did when she decided to choose to believe something, even if she wasn't completely sure. They did the dishes together. He helped her review for a history test. He tucked the crescent moon nightlight on, just before she turned in, even though she told him she was too old for it. He went to the kitchen table and opened his old hard drive again. He didn't look at the bypass file. He just looked at this directory listing all those folders dated from the early years of his career, timestamps going back to when he was 26 years old, and convinced that building something great was enough to protect it. He closed the drive and went to sleep. Rebecca showed up at his door on a Saturday morning with coffee and the expression of someone who had decided not to ask permission. "Before you say anything," she said, walking past him into the kitchen, "I'm not here to tell you what to do." "Good morning, Becca." "Good morning." She set the cups down and turned to face him. She was 2 years older than Jake, with the same dark eyes as both of them, the Myers family inheritance, and the particular brand of stubbornness that had served her well as a labor attorney for 15 years. "I'm here because I have information, and you deserve to have it." Jake poured the coffee she'd brought into actual mugs and sat across from her. "Go ahead." "I have a client. I can't say who, but this client's company does contract infrastructure work for Will's Enterprises." She wrapped both hands around her mug. 3 weeks ago, they were brought in quietly to run a diagnostic on the core system, not the surface layer, the actual foundation. Jake said nothing. "The diagnostic came back with what my client describes as a critical structural vulnerability." Their words. "The original architecture has a load capacity ceiling that was never updated when the company scaled up, which, according to my client, nobody flagged because nobody actually understood how the original system was built." She paused. "Nobody has the documentation, Jake. They've been working around it for years, patching and compensating, but the Singapore expansion would push traffic through that system at 3 times what it's ever handled." "I know," Jake said. Rebecca stopped. "You know." "I figured it out. From the job postings. From a conversation I overheard." She stared at him. "And you didn't—" "No." "Jake." "I said no, Becca. I'm not walking in there." He set his cup down. "Think about what you're asking me to do. Walk into the office of a woman who tells me to clean up spilled coffee. Announce that I'm the one who built everything she's standing on. Have that conversation." He shook his head. "That's not a conversation, that's a humiliation waiting to happen. She's going to look at me like I'm delusional. Her people are going to look at me like I'm some guy who drives cars and has delusions of relevance. You have proof. You have files. I have files on a hard drive that I haven't shared with anyone. In the world as Hannah Wills understands it, the system was built by Martin Greer and his team. Martin Greer can't fix it. Martin Greer can't find his way out of a for loop without a GPS. You said so yourself." Rebecca almost smiled. Almost. "So what happens when it fails?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. From down the hall, he could hear Sophia moving around the particular sound of her morning routine, the squeak of her closet door, the faint music from her phone. "Then it fails," he said, "and it's not my problem." Rebecca looked at him across the table. Not with anger. She'd long since learned that anger didn't move Jake, it just made him quieter. She looked at him with something that was closer to grief. "Laura would have told you to go," she said. It landed the way she knew it would. He didn't flinch. He'd trained himself out of flinching, but his jaw tightened, and he picked up his cup and took a long drink. "Laura would have told me to go," he agreed after a moment. "And then she would have told me to make sure I got paid this time." Rebecca laughed a little. The tension in the kitchen shifted. "There's something else," she said more carefully now. He waited. "My client told me that someone in Hannah's inner circle has been trying to identify the original architect. They pulled contractor records from 17 years ago. Employment files. The name Martin Greer comes up as the project lead. But there's another name in the documentation that keeps appearing as a contributor." She met his eyes. "Jake Myers. It's in the records. Buried but there." Jake went very still. "So far, they haven't connected that name to the man driving her car," Rebecca said. "But they're looking, and at some point, someone is going to make that connection." They sat with that for a moment. "When they do," she said, "you want to be the one controlling how that conversation goes, not reacting to it." Jake stood up and went to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was starting its Saturday morning. A guy walking his dog, 2 kids on bikes, a woman in scrubs getting into a car after what had clearly been a very long night shift. "I built that system," he said, not to Rebecca, Not really to anyone. I built it in 3 years. I worked 18-hour days. I missed Laura's birthday 2 years in a row. I missed Sophia's first steps because I was in a server room in the middle of the night running a load test. His voice was even, controlled, the way it got when the feelings were too large for any other container. And they put Martin Greer's name on it, and I left, because fighting it would have cost more than walking away. He turned back to the room. So yeah, maybe I let it fail. Maybe I let Hannah Wills figure out on her own what happens when you build an empire on someone else's foundation and never bother to learn what the foundation is made of. Rebecca looked at him for a long time. And the people who work there, she said quietly. The people who aren't Hannah Wills. The analysts and the developers and the administrative staff and the people who took that job because they needed it. A pause. The kid who spilled the coffee. Jake closed his eyes briefly. That's not fair, Becca. No, she said. It's not, but it's true. He didn't make any decisions that weekend. He drove his roots, helped Sophia with her project, called his friend Daryl on Sunday evening, and talked about absolutely nothing of consequence for 45 minutes, which was its own form of therapy. But Monday morning, pulling up to the tower, he looked at the building differently than he had before. The rotating door caught the early light and threw it in pieces across the lobby floor. He could see from the car the reception desk and the elevators, and the particular organized chaos of a company building that had more ambition than infrastructure. He thought about the bypass protocol. He'd called it ARIA back when he'd built it. Not for any meaningful reason it was late. He was running on caffeine and stubbornness, and the acronym had arranged itself in his head, and he'd kept it. Adaptive Routing Intelligence Architecture. 2,200 lines of code that lived in a partition 2 layers below the base operating layer, dormant and patient, designed to activate under specific catastrophic load conditions. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody had known to look for it. And nobody without knowing the entry sequence could find it even if they had known. It was the most elegant thing he'd ever built. He'd thought so at the time. In that private way, you sometimes recognize your own best work. He thought so now. He got out of the car and held the door. Oh, the second significant incident happened on a Wednesday. Jake was on 31 again. Prescott had developed the habit of using Jake as an auxiliary errand solution, which Jake tolerated because it got him off the lobby floor and gave him something to do besides exist when he turned a corner and nearly walked directly into Hannah Wills, and a man he recognized with a jolt of cold recognition as Martin Greer. Greer had put on weight in the years since Jake had seen him last. He was heavier through the jaw and the middle, and he wore a suit that cost more than Jake's monthly rent, and he was doing the thing Jake remembered most vividly from their shared history, nodding with complete confidence about something he didn't fully understand. The load issue is solvable, Greer was saying. It's a matter of resource allocation at the routing level. We add processing nodes on the Singapore-facing cluster, redistribute the traffic burden. That's what you said 2 weeks ago, Hannah said. She wasn't moving, which meant this conversation was at the stage where she was still giving it respect she wasn't sure it deserved. What's different now? Now we've had time to map the full architecture. We have a clearer picture. Do you? It wasn't a question. Greer didn't miss a beat. Absolutely. The system is more complex than the original documentation suggested, but my team is confident we can we hit the Singapore date? A pause. Just a half-second too long. Jake, passing behind them with a folder of some kind that Prescott had insisted needed to reach the copy room, caught Greer's expression in profile, the flicker of a man calculating how much uncertainty he could afford to admit. I believe so, Greer said. Hannah turned and walked away, not dismissively, purposefully. The difference was meaningful. She'd heard what she needed to hear, or hadn't heard it, and she was moving on. Greer watched her go. And then, because life had never particularly respected Jake's preferences for anonymity, Greer turned and saw him. The recognition took a moment. It always does with people who never really saw you clearly the first time. Then it landed. "Myers," Greer said. "Greer," Jake said. They stood in the hallway. 2 men and 17 years and a very large unsaid thing between them. Greer's eyes moved over him. The driver's jacket, the folder in his hand, the lack of any badge or credential that would place him in this building as anything other than someone performing a service. Jake watched Greer's face, run the calculation, saw the slight relaxation of his shoulders when the math came out the way Greer wanted it to. "He's a driver. He's nobody. I don't need to be threatened by this." "Good to see you," Greer said, in the tone that meant the opposite. "What are you doing well?" "Doing fine," Jake said. "You?" "Can't complain." Greer adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous gesture Jake remembered from a dozen late nights in the server room. "Are you working here now or—" "Driver," Jake said. "Right." The shoulders dropped another fraction. "Well, good for you. Good to hear." He started to move away, then stopped. "You still do. You keep up with any of the technical side, just out of curiosity." And there it was. Not genuine curiosity. A probe. A test of whether Jake Myers' driver had anything Greer needed to worry about. Jake looked at him for exactly long enough to let Greer feel the look. "A little," Jake said. He walked to the copy room and didn't look back. That night, he called Daryl. Daryl Washington had been Jake's closest friend since their mid-20s, a mechanical engineer who had built his own HVAC company from the ground up and had the particular kind of perspective that comes from having done something hard and having done it right. He also had a gift for cutting through complexity that Jake had always envied. "So let me understand," Daryl said. Jake could hear him in his garage, the faint clink of tools. "You built the engine. They put somebody else's name on the hood, and now the engine is about to blow up and you're sitting in the car watching." "That's about right." "And you haven't decided what to do?" "No." "What's stopping you, real talk?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "Pride, I think. Mostly." "Your pride or theirs?" "Mine." He exhaled. "I don't want to be the guy who shows up hat in hand to a company that threw me out. I don't want to watch Hannah Wills decide in the moment whether I'm worth listening to, and I especially don't want to be there if she decides I'm not." "But she'd be wrong." "People who are wrong with a lot of confidence, Daryl. That doesn't make it easier to be in the room." Daryl set something down on a workbench, metal on metal. "You know what I think? I think you're so focused on what she's going to think of you in that moment that you're forgetting what matters more." "Which is?" "What you think of you in that moment." A pause. "You want to be the man who let the building fall because he was too proud to say he was the one who built it. Is that the story?" Jake stared at the kitchen wall. "And what does Sophia see?" Daryl added, not as pressure, just as a fact laid out on the table. "That's always been the question, man. What does your kid see?" Jake didn't answer right away. He thought about the science fair project on the counter, the poster board they'd finally gotten at the dollar store. He thought about Sophia saying, "Are we going to be okay with her chin in her hand?" and her mother's eyes. He thought about what it meant to stand up for something you built. "I'll call you back," he said. "I know you will," Daryl said. He opened the hard drive that night with a different energy than the nights before. Not hesitation. Something closer to resolve, the kind that comes quietly, not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow accumulation of clarity. He read through the bypass protocol for the first time in 4 years. All 2,200 lines. It held up. Better than held up. It was elegant in a way that made something in him ache slightly, the way you feel looking at a photograph of yourself when you were young and didn't know how good you had it. Arya was intact. Arya was whole. And Arya, if he was reading the situation correctly, was the only thing standing between Will's Enterprises and a catastrophic live failure in front of their new Singapore partners. He sat back and thought about Hannah Will's face when she said, "Clean that up." He thought about Martin Greer adjusting his cufflinks in the hallway. He thought about the kid with the spilled coffee, and the people on that floor who had nothing to do with any of the politics and everything to lose when the system went down. He made a decision. Not about going to Hannah, not yet. One step at a time. The first step was making sure that when he did move, he moved from a position that nobody could dismiss. He connected his old drive to his secure cloud backup, one he'd maintained for years, old habit, like keeping a fireproof box, and he verified the file timestamps. Original creation date. His name embedded in the file metadata. The directory structure that was undeniably, traceably, demonstrably his. Documentation. Proof. A history that couldn't be rewritten. Now, he thought. Now we're starting. He closed the drive. From down the hall in the quiet of the apartment, he could hear the faint night sounds of a city that never fully slept, and beneath it, so familiar, it was almost inaudible, the soft breathing of his daughter. He was not going to be invisible anymore. But he was also not going to walk through that door until he was ready. The alarm was still set for 4:47. He had work to do first. He had 11 days. That was how long he had before the Singapore rollout went into its final pre-launch phase, the point of no return where traffic would begin migrating to the new infrastructure layer, and the load on the original system would start climbing toward the ceiling he'd built into it. The ceiling that nobody on Hannah Will's team knew existed, because nobody on Hannah Will's team had ever been told the truth about where the architecture came from. Jake knew the timeline because he'd listened. Because drivers who become furniture hear everything. He spent the first 3 of those 11 days doing something that looked from the outside like nothing. He drove his routes. He held doors. He said good morning and took the Wacker Street exit and kept the car at 68 degrees because that was the temperature Hannah Wills preferred, and he'd learned it without being told. He ate lunch in the parking structure and read technical documentation on his phone with the focused quiet of a man who had spent decades teaching himself things nobody was going to teach him. He was building a case, not for a courtroom, for a conversation. The most important conversation he was going to have in years, and he was going to walk into it prepared, or he wasn't going to walk into it at all. On the 4th day, Rebecca called again. "They've found the name," she said without preamble. Jake was in the car parked outside the tower, engine running. "Which name?" "Yours. In the original contractor records. Someone in Hannah's legal department pulled the full project documentation from 17 years ago. Actual paper files apparently from some archive they didn't even know they had. And the project lead is listed as Martin Greer. But the primary systems architect..." She paused. "Jake Myers. With your old contact information, your old address, everything." "How long have they had it?" 2 days, maybe 3. My client doesn't know what Hannah's done with it yet, whether she's connected it to you." Jake watched the revolving door. People moved through it in both directions, the particular rhythm of a building that never stopped. "She hasn't said anything to me." "No." Which means either she doesn't know yet, or she knows, and she's deciding how to handle it. "Or she knows, and she doesn't think it matters," Jake said. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "That's also possible." He exhaled through his nose. "Okay. Jake, this changes your position. If they've found your name, the question isn't whether this comes out, it's how it comes out. You can control that, or you can let someone else control it." "I know." "So?" "I know, Becca. I'm working on it." He straightened up in his seat. The revolving door turned. "I'll call you." He hung up and sat with the particular kind of calm that settles over a person when the thing they've been waiting for finally starts moving toward them. Not relief, not fear, something closer to readiness. He had 7 days left. The conversation he hadn't expected came from the most unexpected direction. He was pulling away from the Ashland office on a Thursday afternoon when Hannah's phone rang on the back seat, not her personal cell. The second phone, the one she used for executive calls. And she answered it and then went completely, utterly silent for a full 30 seconds while the person on the other end spoke. Jake had learned to measure her silences. The short ones meant impatience. The medium ones meant calculation. This 30 seconds, then 40, then nearly a full minute meant something had landed that she hadn't seen coming. "Say that again," she said finally. More talking from the other end. Jake kept his eyes forward, his speed, even his breathing quiet. "And Greer's team has looked at this." Her voice was different. Not the controlled executive register she wore like armor. Something underneath was showing. "And they're telling me they can't—" A pause. "How long have you known the magnitude of this, and not—" She stopped herself. When she spoke again, she was controlled again, but Jake could hear the effort it took. "All right. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Have everyone in the main conference room. Everyone. I don't care what they're doing." She ended the call. The car was very quiet. "Jake," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name in 3 weeks. "Yes, Ms. Wills." "How fast can you get me back to the tower?" 14 minutes if I take the bridge." "Take the bridge?" He took the bridge. She didn't make another call. She sat in the back seat in total silence, and in the rearview mirror he could see her doing what he recognized as the hardest thing a certain kind of person knows how to do, reconsidering everything she thought she knew about a situation. He pulled up to the tower in 13 minutes. She got out without a word. Then she stopped, one hand on the door, and said, and he could hear what it cost her, this small thing. "Thank you." She went inside. Jake sat in the car for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he pulled away and drove and thought very carefully about the next 6 days. He told Sophia that night. Not all of it, not the full story, not the years of it, not the weight, but enough. Enough so that she knew why her father had been somewhere else in his head every evening for the past 3 weeks. She deserved that much. They were at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes pushed aside, and she was doing homework, and he said, "There's something I haven't told you about the company I work for." She looked up. When Sophia looked up from homework, you had her full attention. The company. Wills Enterprises. He chose his words carefully, the way you do with someone who is young enough to be hurt by unnecessary darkness, but old enough to deserve truth. "A long time ago, before you were born, I helped build the technology they run on, the core of it, the foundation." She was quiet, listening. "And then the company changed hands, and the people in charge were different people, and my name got removed from the work, and I left, and that was a long time ago." He put both hands flat on the table. "But now the system I built is having problems, and the people who are trying to fix it don't know how it works. And I do." Sophia looked at him steadily. "So why don't you help them?" He almost smiled. "It's complicated." "Why?" "Because the person in charge, Ms. Wills, she doesn't know who I am. She thinks I'm just her driver." Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. "But you're not just her driver." "No." "So tell her. It's not—" "Dad." She set her pencil down. 12 years old, her mother's eyes, her mother's patience, when Jake was being unnecessarily difficult. "I know you always say it's complicated when you mean it's scary. Those aren't the same thing." Jake looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Laura Myers," he said quietly. "You sound exactly like your mother." "Good," Sophia said and picked her pencil back up. "Because Mom was right about everything." He laughed. The real kind, again, the kind that came from somewhere deep enough to actually help. That night, he drafted a letter. Not to Hannah. To himself. Really a documentation of record. A formal accounting of his contributions to the original architecture, dated and detailed and precise with file references and timestamps and technical specifications, that no one could dismiss as the fantasy of a man looking to attach himself to someone else's success. He wrote for 3 hours. When he was done, he had 11 pages. He saved it in the same secure cloud folder as the Aria files. Then he wrote one more document. Brief, 3 paragraphs. A letter to Hannah Wills. He didn't send it. Not yet. He saved it in drafts and closed the laptop and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a while, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong and the one way it could go right. The next morning changed the calculation entirely. Jake was in the lobby, actual lobby, not 31, not Prescott's errand circuit, when he heard raised voices from the direction of the main conference room. Not screaming. The controlled, strangled kind of raised voices that happen when professionals are trying very hard not to scream. He was too far away to make out words, but the body language of the 2 people who came through the conference room door told him everything. One of them was a woman he didn't recognize, mid-40s tech department, by the look of her, moving with the tight-jawed gait of someone who has just been told something that confirmed her worst fears. The other was Martin Greer. Greer looked pale. Jake had never in all the years he'd known him seen Martin Greer look pale. Greer operated at a constant temperature of aggressive confidence regardless of the reality around him. It was his primary professional tool. Watching him walk through that lobby looking pale and slightly diminished was a strange thing, like watching a weather phenomenon you'd read about but never expected to see. Greer didn't see Jake, or didn't register him same thing in practice. The woman with him stopped at the elevators and said in a voice too tight to be professional, "So what do we do? Martin, I need you to tell me right now what we do, because my team has been running diagnostic after diagnostic for 3 weeks, and every answer we come up with leads to the same dead end." Greer pressed the elevator button. "We escalate the node allocation, buy ourselves time. We've tried that, twice. The architecture doesn't support it at the base level. It's like..." She stopped herself, searched for the analogy. "It's like trying to put more water through a pipe that's already at maximum pressure. We can't fix the symptom without fixing the source, and we don't know what the source is, not fully." "I know what the source is." "Then tell me, because your team has been telling my team that for 3 weeks, and we still don't have..." The elevator opened. Greer stepped in. "I'll send you a technical summary by end of day." The doors closed. The woman stood at the elevator for a moment with her hand half raised as if the doors might reopen. They didn't. She dropped her hand. She turned around and her eyes landed on Jake, really landed the way eyes rarely did, and he could see in her face the full weight of a person who is out of options and knows it. She walked toward the exit. Jake made a decision. "Excuse me," he said. She stopped, turned, looked at him with the particular expression people aim at unknown men in lobbies who address them without introduction. "I know that's not your problem," Jake said, "but I couldn't help overhearing. The base architecture issue, the load ceiling problem." He kept his voice even. "Just a man. Just information. I think I might know what the source is." She looked at him. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Jake Myers. I drive for Ms. Wills." A pause. And then, because engineers are fundamentally different from executives in this one crucial way, they care about whether a solution works more than they care about who's offering it, she said, "What do you know about the architecture?" "Enough to know that node allocation won't fix it. You'd need to increase it by a factor of 4 to see any improvement, and you'd still hit the ceiling because the base routing logic can't redistribute the load above a certain threshold. That's not a resource problem. That's a structural problem. It's in the routing layer." She stared at him. "The original architecture has a hard ceiling built into the base routing," he continued. "It was a design decision made in year 2. At the time, the projected load was significantly lower. Nobody flagged it for revision because nobody understood how the ceiling was implemented." "How do you know this?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Jake looked at her steadily. "Because I'm the one who built it." The lobby was quiet around them. The revolving door turned. Someone walked past with a coffee. Somewhere above them on 31 or 32 or wherever Martin Greer was composing his end-of-day technical summary that wasn't going to solve anything the clock was running. The woman's name Jake would learn in the next 3 minutes was Dr. Priya Anand. She'd been with Wills Enterprises for 8 years and ran infrastructure development, which meant the failing system was in every professional sense her problem to solve. She was also, as he would quickly discover, exactly the kind of engineer who asks the right questions and doesn't stop until she has the right answers. "Walk me through it," she said. He did, right there in the lobby, keeping his voice low and his language precise. He walked her through the routing logic, the ceiling, and the reason Greer's node allocation approach was a finger in a dam rather than a fix. He didn't mention area yet. One step at a time. Priya listened with the complete focused attention of someone who is hearing for the first time an explanation that makes everything else make sense. She asked 2 technical questions. He answered both. She asked a third. "You built the entire base layer," she said. "Yes." "Then how are you?" She gestured carefully at his jacket. "Long story," Jake said. "The short version is that my name wasn't on the work when it left my hands." She absorbed this, processed it the way an engineer processes data, without sentiment, with precision. "And you've been driving for Ms. Wills for how long?" "About a month." "And you haven't said anything." "I'm saying something now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to get you in front of my team. Today. Right now if possible. That's going to need to go through Ms. Wills." Priya's expression shifted just slightly. "That's complicated." "I know," Jake said, "but it's how it needs to happen." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working it out, the logistics of it, the politics of it, the question of how you tell your CEO that the answer to the company's most critical problem has been standing in the lobby every morning for 4 weeks. "Okay," she said. "Let me talk to her." "Before you do," Jake said, "I need you to understand something. If I come into this building in a different capacity, it won't be as a favor. I know what I built. I know what it's worth. And I know that there is exactly one person in the world who can walk this company back from the edge it's heading for, and that person has been driving Miss Will's car for the past month." Priya looked at him with something new in her expression. Not quite respect, they hadn't been in a room long enough for that, but the preliminary form of it. Recognition. "I understand," she said. "Good," Jake said. "Then I'll wait to hear from you." She left. He watched her cross the lobby and get into the elevator. He turned back to his post by the door. His heart was going harder than he'd let on. He could feel it in his chest, the particular percussive weight of a thing set in motion that could not be stopped now. He'd done the one thing he'd told himself for weeks he wasn't going to do. He'd opened the door. Now it was up to Hannah Wills whether she walked through it. Priya got back to him in 2 hours. Not a message through the dispatch system, which was so impersonal that it was almost funny Ms. Wills would like to schedule a meeting. "Are you available at 4 p.m.? He typed back, "Yes." He spent the time between 2 and 4 in the parking structure, sitting in the car going through the mental preparation the way an athlete goes through physical preparation before competition. Not anxiety, he'd carried the anxiety for 17 years, and he was done with it. Clarity. The facts of what he knew arranged in the order he was going to present them. The technical case, the documentation, the files. And at the end of it, if everything held, area. Rebecca called at 2:30, and he let it go to voicemail. He'd call her after. At 3:50, he went upstairs. The conference room on 31 was smaller than it looked from the hallway. Or maybe it felt smaller because of who was in it. Priya was there with a younger engineer Jake didn't recognize, and Hannah Wills sat at the head of the table in a charcoal blazer and the particular composed stillness of a person who has been thinking hard and arrived at a position. There was no coffee this time. Nobody was checking their phone. Hannah looked at Jake when he came in, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in 4 weeks, and something moved across her face. Not recognition. Assessment. She was measuring the distance between what she thought she knew and what might actually be true. "Mr. Myers," she said, "please sit down." He sat. She put both hands flat on the table. "Dr. Anand has told me what you shared with her this morning. I want to hear it directly from you." A pause. "All of it." Jake looked at Hannah Wills across the conference table. 17 years. A company built on work she didn't know he'd done. A month of held doors and ignored moments, and a coffee thrown in the trash with his change still in the cup. He thought about Sophia saying those aren't the same thing. Complicated and scary. "All right," he said. "Then I'll start at the beginning." And he did. He started with the year. 2007, Jake said. Meridian Technologies. Third floor of a building on West Monroe that doesn't exist anymore. 12 people, 2 coffee pots, and a server rack that overheated every time the temperature outside dropped below 20 degrees because the building's HVAC was held together with prayers and cable ties. Hannah didn't move. Priya had a legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand. The younger engineer, his name was Dev Jake, had caught it when Priya introduced him, had a laptop open and his fingers ready, but wasn't typing yet. "I joined the team as a contractor," Jake continued. "Brought in because the lead developer, who was good, genuinely good. I want to be fair, had designed the user-facing layer beautifully but hadn't built for scale. The infrastructure underneath wasn't going to hold what the company needed it to hold. I was there to fix that." "And Greer," Hannah said. Martin was the project lead. His job was client-facing management timeline. He was good at that. He wasn't an infrastructure architect, and he knew it, which is why they brought me in. Jake kept his voice even. "The work we did over the next 2 years, the base layer, the routing logic, the load distribution framework, that was mine. Martin signed off on it. He presented it to the board. His name went on the documentation." A pause. He let that sit. "And yours didn't," Hannah said. It wasn't a question. There were contractor agreements that were interpreted generously in the company's favor, and by the time I realized what was happening, the situation had deteriorated enough that fighting it would have meant a legal battle I couldn't afford. He looked at the table for a moment. "My wife was sick. We had a 2-year-old. I made the call to walk away." The room was quiet. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Jake said, looking up. "I'm telling you because you need to understand the full picture of what you're sitting on. The system running this company, its core, its foundation was built by me, not by Martin Greer. And because of that, I know things about it that are not in any documentation you have access to." Hannah Wills had a very particular quality when she was genuinely listening. She went absolutely still. Not checked out, still. Not impatient, still. Present, still. Like everything that wasn't this conversation had been set aside in a separate room. She was doing that now. "What things?" she said. Jake looked at her. "Before I get to that, I want to show you something." He set his phone on the table, opened to a file viewer, and turned it so she could see the screen. "These are time-stamped project files from my personal archive. The original base layer code. File creation dates beginning October 2007. My name embedded in the metadata. Version history annotation logs the full development record." He let her look. "This isn't something I assembled recently. This is the original work. I can have it independently verified by any forensic software analyst you choose." Priya leaned in and looked at the screen. Her eyes moved quickly the way an engineer's do when they're reading technical data, not skimming parsing. She sat back after a moment with an expression that was somewhere between professional acknowledgement and something more personal. "The file structure matches," she said to Hannah, quietly. "The architecture we've been trying to reverse engineer. The annotation style, the variable naming conventions, this matches. Hannah looked at Priya, then back at Jake. "All right," she said. "What is it you know that isn't in the documentation?" Jake took a breath. This was the part he'd thought about for 11 days, the part he'd thought about honestly for 17 years, in the way you think about a locked room in your own house that you never go back into. He thought about Sophia saying those aren't the same thing, complicated and scary. "When I built the base layer," he said, "I knew that eventually the system would be pushed beyond its original design parameters. Systems always are. Companies grow markets, expand the thing you built for 10,000 users gets handed 1,000,000. So I designed a contingency." He paused. "A bypass protocol, hidden in a partition 2 levels below the base operating layer. It's dormant, has been for 17 years, but it's there. And it's intact." Dev looked up from his laptop for the first time. "What kind of bypass protocol?" "Adaptive routing. When the primary load distribution system hits its ceiling, which it is going to hit within the next 4 days, based on the traffic projections I've been running, the bypass activates and redistributes the load across a secondary routing architecture that I built in parallel with the original." Jake looked at Dev directly. "It's not a patch. It's not a band-aid. It was designed as a permanent alternative routing system that can handle 3 times the load capacity of the primary. I called it Area." Silence. Dev was staring at him with the expression of someone who has just been told that the house they've been trying to renovate has a fully furnished second floor that nobody knew about. "3 times the load capacity," Dev said slowly, "with room to scale further. The secondary architecture was built on a different framework than the primary, more flexible. I had better tools by year 3 than I'd had in year 1. Jake turned back to Hannah. "The Singapore rollout wouldn't just survive the traffic increase with ARIA active, it would be comfortable." Hannah Wills was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were still flat on the table. Jake noticed that her knuckles were slightly white. "Why?" she said, and he could hear the weight of what she was really asking. Not just "why didn't you tell us sooner," but the whole question, the full 17-year question. Why didn't you disclose this when you left the company? It was the right question, the honest question. He'd expected it, and he'd thought about the answer for days, and he'd arrived at the only answer that was actually true. "Because I was angry," he said, "and I was hurt, and I was 28 years old, and I'd just watched 2 years of my best work get handed to someone else, and my wife was in and out of the hospital, and the last thing I wanted to do was give that company one more piece of myself on my way out the door." He met her eyes. "That was the wrong call. I know that now. People would have been better served if I'd handled it differently. But that's the honest answer." Hannah looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. "And now," she said. "Now I'm here," Jake said, "telling you." What happened in the next hour was the most compressed piece of professional intensity Jake had experienced since the early Meridian years, and he'd thought that part of his life was finished. Priya pulled her chair around to Jake's side of the table, and Dev moved his laptop in front of both of them, and Jake walked them through the access protocol for the ARIA partition, the entry sequence, the directory path, the activation parameters. Dev was fast, technically fluent, and asked exactly the right questions in exactly the right order, which Jake found unexpectedly refreshing after weeks of watching Greer's team fail to ask any of them. Hannah sat at the head of the table and watched. She didn't interject, she didn't check her phone. She watched, and Jake could feel her watching, could feel the weight of her reassessment moving through the room like a change in air pressure. At one point, Dev found the area partition in the system and said in a voice that was almost involuntary, "Oh, wow." Priya looked at the screen, then at Jake. This is really clean work." "Thank you," Jake said. It was such a small thing. Clean work. But it landed somewhere he hadn't expected, somewhere that had been waiting a long time to receive it. They were 40 minutes into the technical walkthrough when the conference room door opened. Martin Greer walked in. He had his tablet under his arm and the expression of a man who'd been called into a meeting he hadn't been told the full purpose of, which meant someone had told him enough to make him move quickly, but not enough to give him time to prepare a position. He stopped when he saw Jake. Not a flicker this time. A full stop. "What is he doing in here?" Greer said. "Sit down, Martin," Hannah said. "Hannah, this man is a driver. He's a contracted driver. He doesn't have clearance to be in a technical—" "Martin." Her voice didn't rise. It just became very precise. "Sit down." Greer sat. He looked at Jake with an expression that was trying very hard to be contempt and landing closer to fear. "Mr. Myers has been sharing some information about the original architecture," Hannah said. "Information I think you're going to want to hear." "I know the original architecture," Greer said immediately. "I led that project. Whatever he thinks he knows." "Martin." Jake said it quietly, not angrily, tiredly. "The way you say someone's name when you've had this argument before, and you're done having it. Don't." Greer looked at him. "Just don't," Jake said. "I'm not here to go back over 17 years of grievances. I'm here because this company has a problem I can solve, and going in circles about who gets credit for what isn't going to help anyone in this room." He held Greer's eyes. "You know what I built. You've always known. And you also know that you've been in this building for 3 weeks, unable to fix it, which means at some point today, you are going to have to tell Hannah that you're out of options. So I'm going to save us all that conversation." Greer's jaw was tight. Something moved through his face, several things in quick succession, and then went still. He looked at the table. It wasn't an admission, but it wasn't a denial either. Hannah looked at Greer for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she turned back to Dev. "Where are we?" "We can initiate the area protocol in stages," Dev said, his voice carrying the focused energy of someone who has just gotten access to a tool they didn't know they had. "We'd want to run a controlled activation test in the staging environment first, maybe 4 hours before we touch the production layer. If the test holds, we can sequence the full activation ahead of the Singapore rollout." He looked at Jake. "How confident are you in the protocol's stability after 17 years of dormancy?" "Very," Jake said. "The partition is isolated, it hasn't been touched or degraded, but run the staging test regardless. I'd want you to." Dev nodded. "We should start tonight." Priya looked at Hannah. "With your authorization." Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have it." Priya and Dev were already moving gathering equipment, and the younger engineer said something technical to Priya under his breath, and she nodded, and they were out of the room with the contained urgency of people who have a clear problem and finally have a path to the solution. And then it was Hannah and Greer and Jake. Greer left first. He stood up without being asked to leave, and he looked at Jake once more on his way out, a look that contained a great many things that would probably never be said between them. Which was fine, which was honest, and he walked out and closed the door. Jake sat across from Hannah Wills in the quiet conference room. "I owe you an apology," she said. He hadn't expected it that directly. He kept his expression neutral. "For what specifically?" "For what specifically?" she repeated. And there was something in her voice that might have been the beginning of dark humor, a recognition of the absurdity of having to choose between items on a list. "The coffee. Your first week the intern dropped a cup in the lobby and I told you to clean it up." She said it plainly without dressing it. That was dismissive and it was wrong. "It wasn't the worst thing that happened to me that week," Jake said. "No, I don't imagine it was." She looked at the table for a moment. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Myers. I grew up around people who were dismissed. My father owned a dry cleaning business on the South Side. He worked 70 hours a week and people talked to him like he was a vending machine." She looked up. "I swore I wouldn't be that person. And somewhere in the past few years of running this company, I became exactly that person. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking you to know that I see it." Jake was quiet. He'd prepared for a lot of versions of this conversation. This wasn't one of them. "The work you did," Hannah said, The system you built. It's been holding this company up for 17 years. We have 460 employees. We have clients in 11 countries. We have a Singapore rollout that could define the next decade of this company." She paused. "And none of it would exist without a foundation you built in a loft on West Monroe and then walked away from because we didn't treat you right." He didn't respond immediately. He let the words exist in the room for a moment without qualifying them. "I want to make this right," Hannah said. "And I don't mean right in the sense of, I'm not talking about a check and a handshake and a thank you plaque. I'm talking about actually making this right." She sat forward slightly. "I need to know what that looks like to you." Jake looked at his hands for a moment. He thought about all the nights at the kitchen table with the hard drive and the cursor blinking. He thought about Sophia's face when he told her the story, the uncomplicated certainty of a 12-year-old who looked at a complicated thing and found the simple truth inside it. "Tell her. My name on the work," he said. "That's the first thing. Not a footnote. The actual record corrected in whatever form is legally and publicly appropriate." He met her eyes. "My daughter is 12 years old. When she's old enough to look up what her father spent his 20s building, I want her to be able to find it." Hannah nodded once. "Done." "Second thing." He kept his voice steady. "Compensation for the past 17 years is a complicated legal question, and I'm not going to walk in here and name a number because that conversation needs lawyers and documentation and time. But I want the conversation to happen, formally fairly with both sides at the table." "Agreed." "And the third thing." He paused. "I want to see this through. Not as a driver, not as a consultant you call when the building's on fire. I want to be present through the Singapore rollout. I want to work with Priya's team. And after that," he let the sentence breathe for a moment. "After that, we'll see what makes sense for both of us." Hannah looked at him. He could see her working through it, the logistics, the optics, the practicalities. And then he watched her set all of that aside. "One more question," she said. "Why come forward now? You had the bypass. You had the documentation. You could have let it fail and watched from the parking structure." It was the question Daryl had asked him, essentially. It was the question he'd been asking himself for 11 days. "Because 460 people work in this building," he said. "And the kid who dropped the coffee in the lobby is one of them." He paused. "And because I have a daughter who's watching what her father does when it's hard. And I'd rather she see me do the right thing than see me protect my pride." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "Your daughter is lucky," she said. "I know," Jake said. "I tell her that every day. She disagrees." The corner of Hannah's mouth moved. It was the first time he'd seen anything resembling a smile from her that wasn't directed at someone she needed something from. The staging test ran from 8 that evening until just past midnight. Jake was there for all of it in the server room on the 22nd floor with Priya and Dev and 2 other engineers he was introduced to briefly and whose names he filed away working through the activation sequence with the meticulous patience of someone who had written every line of it himself and knew exactly where the weight was and how it would settle. He didn't feel like a driver in that room. He felt like himself. At 11:47, Dev ran the final load simulation traffic projections at Singapore rollout capacity ×3 and watched the numbers climb. An area caught the load and distributed it the way Jake had designed it to distribute it 17 years ago in a server room that overheated in winter, and every metric held. Priya looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at Jake. 17 years, she said. "Give or take," he said. "How did you know?" she asked. Not technically she understood the technical answer. She meant the other thing, the human thing. "How did you know it would still hold?" Jake thought about it. "I built it to last," he said simply. "I was young, and I was angry, and I cared too much. And when you build something that way, when you put that into it, sometimes it holds." She nodded slowly. Dev was already running the production migration sequence, cueing the steps for the following morning with the focused momentum of someone who hasn't slept and doesn't care. Jake walked him through the final activation parameters and answered 3 more technical questions, and felt for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember useful in the way he was supposed to be useful. He left the building at midnight. The city was its nighttime self, quieter, sharper, the particular quality of urban dark that always made Jake feel more alone than outdoor dark, but more awake too. He sat in his car in the parking structure for a moment before starting the engine. He called Rebecca. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been asleep, which meant she'd been waiting. "Well," she said. "We had the meeting," he said. And we're in." He exhaled. "Aria is running in staging. Clean. We go live in the morning." Rebecca made a sound that was not quite a word, more like the release of something that had been held for a very long time. "Jake," she said. "I know." "Laura would." "I know Becca." His voice was quiet. Not sad exactly. Settled. The way ground feels after rain. "I know she would." He drove home through the nighttime city. He parked, went upstairs, moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light. The crescent moon nightlight was on in Sophia's room, throwing its soft shape across the hallway floor. He stood in the doorway for a moment and watched his daughter sleep. 12 years old, her mother's eyes closed now, the slow, easy breathing of someone who had gone to sleep, trusting that the world was in competent hands. He had one thing left to tell her in the morning, that the hands were. End of Part 4. Part 5. Fan kết thúc. Lưu ý viết 3.000 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện phá hối thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba giữ độ kịch tính, không viết lần mạn. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mục document không tam. 31. Orchestrated emotionally resonant narrative conclusion, seamlessly bridging previous story parts. Orchestrated emotionally resonant narrative conclusion, seamlessly bridging previous story parts. Part 5. What was built to last. The alarm went off at 4:47. Jake sat up in the dark, planted both feet on the cold hardwood floor, and did not let himself feel the weight of it all for exactly 30 seconds, the way he always did. This morning, he needed those 30 seconds more than usual, because this morning was different from every morning that had come before it in the past 17 years, and he knew it, and he sat with it in the dark and let it be true. Then he got up, made coffee, moved through the kitchen the way he always did. But when he passed the refrigerator, he stopped. He looked at the photograph, the three of them at the beach 6 years ago. Laura with her hair blowing sideways, laughing at something off camera. Sophia at 6, squinting against the sun. Jake with his arm around his wife, looking at her instead of the camera, because he always looked at her instead of the camera. "Today's the day," he said quietly to the photograph. To Laura. To whatever version of her still lived in the space between the things he remembered and the things he couldn't let go of. "I think you'd say I waited too long, but you'd also say I got there." He poured the coffee into his thermos. He did not pick up the dispatch app. He was at the tower at 7:15 earlier than his usual time. Not as a driver, this time. No black jacket, no post by the door. He wore the dark gray sweater Sophia had given him for Christmas, and the boots he kept for occasions that required something other than utility, and he walked through the revolving door, the way a person walks through a door they belong on the other side of. Priya met him at the elevator. She looked like someone who had slept 3 hours and didn't care which Jake recognized as the specific appearance of an engineer who has been too focused to notice she's tired. She had 2 cups of coffee from the building cafe and handed him one without comment, which he appreciated. "How are the staging numbers?" he asked. "Holding. Dev ran 2 more simulations overnight. The load distribution is performing above the projected parameters." She pressed the elevator button. "Above, Jake. Not at. Above." "I know," he said. "I built it optimistic." She looked at him. "You built it optimistic." "It was year 3. I still believed in things." The elevator opened and they stepped in, and Priya was quiet for a moment before she said, "For what it's worth, and I know it's not my place to say this, what you did last night, being in that room, walking my team through it, the way you did." Dev hasn't stopped talking about it. He's been in infrastructure engineering for 6 years, and he said he's never seen architecture built with that kind of, his word was intention. She paused. "He means it as the highest compliment." Jake looked at the elevator doors. "Tell him thank you. Tell him yourself. He's been here since 5. The production activation was scheduled for 9 a.m. At 8:40, the conference room on 31 was fuller than it had been the day before. Priya's full team, 7 engineers, ranging from Dev's barely contained energy to a quiet senior developer named Carolyn, who had the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough systems fail to have stopped being surprised by anything and started being relieved by solutions. Hannah was there. Her chief operating officer, a tall man named Sterling, who had the practiced calm of someone paid to be calm in rooms where other people weren't, was there. Martin Greer was not there. Jake noticed it, but didn't comment on it. He'd think about that later, or he wouldn't. Some things didn't require resolution so much as they required being set down. Hannah stood at the head of the table and said, "Before anything else, I want to say something before we start." The room settled. "Most of you know pieces of what's happened in the last 24 hours. I want to make sure everyone in this room has the full picture, because going forward, everyone in this room is going to be working with this information, and I believe in people having the truth." She looked around the table, and then she looked at Jake. "The architecture that runs this company, the base layer, the routing framework, the infrastructure we've been trying to understand for the past 3 weeks was designed and built by Jake Myers, beginning in 2007 and completed over a 3-year period. Jake was a contractor at Meridian Technologies, and his work was fundamental, not contributory. Fundamental." She paused. "His name was not on that work when it left his hands. That was an injustice, and it is one that this company is going to correct formally, publicly, and permanently." The room was very quiet. "Jake is here today in a different capacity than some of you may be used to seeing him," Hannah continued. "He is here as what he has always been, the architect of this company's foundation. And what we're about to do this morning would not be possible without him." She sat down. Carolyn, the quiet senior developer, looked at Jake across the table with an expression that was simple and direct and required no interpretation. She nodded once. He nodded back. Dev said under his breath, but not quietly enough, "Let's go," and they went. The activation took 4 hours. Not because anything went wrong, nothing went wrong. Because Jake insisted on sequencing it carefully, staging the load transfer in deliberate increments rather than switching it over all at once, which was technically the more conservative approach and practically the difference between a controlled burn and setting a house on fire to get rid of a wasp nest. Priya backed him without hesitation. Hannah, who Jake was learning, had the capacity to defer to expertise when she trusted it did not push for speed. Jake sat at a workstation next to Dev and walked the team through each stage. His hands on the keyboard felt like something returning a muscle memory deeper than the daily work of driving, older and more particular, the memory of a version of himself he'd thought was gone. At one point, somewhere around the 3rd stage transfer, Dev looked at a metric on his screen and said, Wait, look at this. The secondary routing layer is actually redistributing more efficiently than the primary ever did. It's not just absorbing the load, it's optimizing it in real time." Carolyn leaned in, read the screen. "That's an adaptive function." "It's ARIA, Jake said. "The routing intelligence isn't static. It learns the traffic patterns and adjusts. He kept his eyes on his own screen. I told you I built it optimistic. Priya made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a gasp, and was somewhere in between the two. By 12:30, the production migration was complete. Aria was live. The Singapore traffic channel was open, and the load was moving through the secondary architecture, the way water moves through a well-designed channel, without resistance, without drama, exactly as designed. Dev pulled up the final dashboard. Every metric green. Load distribution sitting at 31% of Aria's total capacity, with room to grow to 300% before it would need further architectural consideration. Dev stared at the screen for a moment. Then he turned to Jake and said, 17 years. Give or take, Jake said. Dev shook his head slowly. Man, I've been doing this for 6 years, and I genuinely have never seen anything built like this. This is going to hold for another 17, at least. At least? Jake agreed. Carolyn, who Jake was beginning to understand, spoke rarely, and chose her moments accordingly, said from across the room. It was built by someone who cared whether it lasted. The room held that for a moment, and Jake felt something in his chest. Not the old anger, not the years of it, not the weight of everything that had been taken from him. Something else. Something cleaner. The recognition of a thing done right, acknowledged rightly, after a very long time in the dark. Hannah asked him to stay after the room cleared. Sterling had gone to handle the Singapore communications. Priya and her team had moved to the monitoring station to watch the live traffic numbers roll in. Dev had not technically left so much as relocated to a different corner with his laptop and a second coffee, and the focused joy of a person living in his best professional moment. Hannah and Jake were alone in the conference room for the second time in 2 days. But it felt different. The air pressure of the room was different. Something had been resolved that had been unresolved for a long time. Hannah sat across from him with her hands around a coffee cup and said, I'd like to talk about what comes next, if you're willing. I'm willing, Jake said. I spoke with Sterling and with our legal counsel this morning before the activation. She set the cup down. We're prepared to make a formal correction to the company's historical record, patent records, internal documentation, the official company history that we publish and maintain. Your name, your contributions documented accurately. She met his eyes. We'll also be initiating a compensation discussion. Our legal team will reach out to you, or to whoever represents you, if you choose to have representation within the week. I want that process to be fair, and I want it to be real. Not a settlement that's designed to be as small as we can get away with. Fair. Jake nodded. And there's a third thing I want to propose, Hannah said. And I want to be clear that there is no pressure here. This is a genuine offer, not an obligation. She paused. I'd like to bring you on in a formal capacity. Advisory to start. There are decisions this company makes about its technical infrastructure that would benefit from your perspective. Area running in production is its transformative for what we can do in the next decade. And I don't want to run the next decade without the person who understands it best somewhere in the conversation. Jake looked at her across the table. He thought about the dispatch app on his phone that he hadn't opened this morning. He thought about Sophia, who would be in school right now, probably in her second period history class, probably doing the thing she did where she finished the reading early and spent the rest of the period trying not to look impatient. I have conditions, he said. I expected that. Sophia has 3 more years before high school. I need flexibility. I'm not going back to 18-hour days. He said it plainly without apology. She's the most important thing I'm building right now, and any arrangement that doesn't account for that isn't an arrangement I can accept. Understood, Hannah said without hesitation. What else? I want Priya as the primary working relationship. She's good. Her team is good. I can work with them. She'd say the same about you. And the record needs to be public, Jake said. Not internal, public. A press statement, a formal revision to the company's founding narrative, whatever form is appropriate. My daughter should be able to Google her father's name and find the truth." Hannah was quiet for a moment, and he could see in her face the same thing he'd seen when she'd talked about her father's dry cleaning business, the recognition of what it meant to have your work seen. To have the thing you gave your life to acknowledged in the world as yours. "Yes," she said. "All of it." Jake sat back. He exhaled slowly. He thought about the photograph on the refrigerator. He thought about Laura saying, "You'll build something even better." "Then I think we have the beginning of an agreement," he said. Hannah looked at him for a moment, and then she extended her hand across the table. Not the way she shook hands in meetings, the controlled professional grip that was a form of communication as calculated as anything else she did. This was different. Simpler. He shook it. He called Rebecca from the parking structure at 1:15. She picked up before the first ring had finished, which meant she had been holding her phone for the past 6 hours, which was exactly what he'd expected. "Tell me," she said. "Aria is live. Production, Singapore traffic running clean, every metric holding." She made a sound like she'd been punched in a good way. "Hannah acknowledged the record publicly in front of her full technical team this morning," Jake continued. "Legal process starts this week. Formal press correction is in the works. And she offered me an advisory position." Jake. Rebecca's voice had something in it that was trying to be her lawyer voice and not making it. "Jake. I know. Laura. I know Becca. I know." She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear in the silence that she was doing the thing she'd done since they were kids, the thing his sister had always done when something big happened. She went quiet before she went emotional, the way the air goes still before rain. "I need you to hear something," she said finally. "Okay. I have been your person in this for 17 years. I watched you walk out of that company with a box and a broken marriage and a sick wife and a 2-year-old. I watched you hold everything together when Laura was gone. I watched you drive that car every morning at 5 a.m. and never complain." Her voice was steady now, the way it got when she was saying something she'd been saving. "You did not do this because it was easy. You did not do this because someone finally made it safe enough for you to do it. You did this because you decided to when it was still hard and still scary, and you still weren't sure how it was going to go. And I need you to know that what you did today, what you've been doing for the last 11 days, that's the bravest thing I've ever watched you do." Jake sat in the car in the parking structure and did not speak for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Don't just okay me, Jake Myers. I'm not just okaying you." His voice was quieter than he intended. "I hear you. I hear every word." He paused. "Thank you for not letting me stay invisible." She made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. "Go get your daughter. Tell her what happened." "I'm going." "And Jake?" "Yeah. Get yourself paid this time." He laughed, the real kind. "Working on it." He picked Sophia up from school at 3:15, which he almost never did, because she took the bus and they'd agreed years ago that the bus was fine. But today, he was sitting in the school pickup line in his personal car, not the town car, his own beat-up Civic, when she came through the doors with her backpack, and stopped when she saw him tilting her head slightly the way she did when the world didn't match her expectations. She got in the car. "You're here," she said. "I'm here." She buckled her seatbelt. "What happened?" It wasn't a question. It was Sophia. It was Laura's eyes and Laura's precision reading the air in the car, the way she'd always been able to read the air around her father. Jake pulled out of the pickup line and drove for a few moments without speaking. Then he said, "I told you about the company. About what I built." "I remember." "I talked to Hannah Wills yesterday. I showed her the work, the documentation." He kept his eyes on the road. "And this morning we activated Aria." Sophia was quiet. "The system is running," Jake said. "Clean. Better than projected. And Ms. Wills Hannah, she's correcting the record. Officially. My name on the work, all of it. He paused. And she offered me a real position, something that uses what I actually know how to do. He heard Sophia exhale. It was a particular kind of exhale, the kind that carries more than air. Dad, she said. Yeah. I'm really proud of you. He had to drive for a moment without speaking because his throat did something it occasionally did at inopportune moments, and he had learned over the years to just wait for it. I know you are, he said when he could, and that matters to me more than anything that happened today. Everything, she said in the particular tone she used when she was testing for sincerity. Everything, he confirmed. She was quiet for a block. Then, are you going to stop driving the car? Probably, yeah. Are you sad about it? Jake thought about that. About the parking structure and the lobby and the 31 floors and 4 weeks of invisibility. About the cold marble floors and the dispatch app and the $12 tips that were supposed to be generous. About all of it. No, he said. I'm not sad about it. She nodded. Then, can we get food to celebrate? Like actual food, not pasta. He laughed. Yeah, actual food. With dessert. With dessert. She settled back in her seat with the satisfied expression of someone who has achieved a significant objective. And Jake drove, and the afternoon light came through the windshield the way afternoon light does in October in Chicago. At an angle gold and a little sharp. The kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they were worth something all along. 3 weeks later, the press statement went out. It was on the Wills Enterprises website and distributed to the relevant tech and business press, and it was, Hannah had clearly had someone very good write it or had written it herself. He couldn't tell honest and direct and complete. It did not minimize what had happened. It stated clearly that the foundational architecture of Wills Enterprises had been designed and built by Jake Myers between 2007 and 2010. That this contribution had not been properly credited in the company's historical record, that the company was correcting that record formally, and with deep acknowledgement of the injustice of the original omission. It used the word injustice. Jake had not asked for that. Hannah had put it in herself. Rebecca sent him the link at 6:47 in the morning with a single message. There it is. He was at the kitchen table when he read it. Sophia was still asleep. The crescent moon nightlight was still on in her room. The photograph was on the refrigerator. He read the statement twice. Then he set his phone down and looked at the window and let himself feel for a long, sustained moment all of it. The years of it, the loss of it. The anger that had lived in his chest so long it had become structural. And now slowly, unmistakably, the process of that anger being replaced by something that had more room in it. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it, the early form. He got up and made coffee. At 7:15, he heard Sophia's alarm. He heard the squeak of the closet door, the faint music from her phone, the particular sounds of his daughter beginning her day, and he stood at the kitchen counter and waited. She came in wearing her school hoodie, her hair still unbrushed, her eyes not yet fully committed to being open. She poured herself a glass of orange juice and stood at the counter beside him and said without looking at the phone that he'd left out on the table, "Is that the thing?" "Yeah," he said. "That's the thing." She picked up the phone. She read it, her eyes moving carefully across the screen, the way she read anything important without rushing all the way to the end. Then she set the phone back down on the table. "Good," she said. That was it. One word. The Sophia version of everything. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had since she was small, with her full weight without reservation, the way a kid leans on a parent when she has learned through experience that the parent is not going to move. He did not move. Outside the kitchen window, Chicago was beginning its day. The city that had held him through the worst of it and was now holding him through something that felt cautiously like the beginning of better. Below their window, a man walked his dog. A bus hissed past. Someone somewhere was making coffee in an apartment that was theirs and warm and enough. Jake Myers had built something that lasted 17 years without anyone knowing his name. He had a daughter who knew his name and what it meant and what it was worth. And he had walked through the hardest door, not the glass door of the tower on Michigan Avenue, not the conference room on 31, not the conversation with Hannah Wills across the table. The hardest door was the one inside himself, the one he'd kept closed for 17 years, because opening it meant admitting that what had been taken from him still mattered, still hurt, still deserved to be reclaimed. He had opened it. He was still standing. Some things, when they are built with care and intention and the stubborn belief that they ought to last, they last. Systems. Architecture. The work of quiet people in rooms that didn't have their names on the door. And some things last even longer than that. The kind of father a man decides to be. The kind of person a daughter watches him become. The silent, daily, unglamorous work of showing up for the alarm at 4:47 for the pasta 3 nights a week, for the science fair poster from the dollar store, for the truth told late but told fully, for the door opened when it would have been easier to keep it shut. That kind of work doesn't go dormant. It doesn't get buried 2 levels below the base layer where nobody thinks to look. It lives in the open, in the ordinary light of ordinary mornings, visible to the only person whose opinion was ever going to matter most. Sophia Myers finished her orange juice, announced that she was going to be late, and disappeared back down the hallway with the unhurried urgency of a 12-year-old who was not actually going to be late, but liked to reserve the right to claim she might be. Jake Myers stood in his kitchen in the apartment that was theirs in the city that had held them, and felt for the first time in a very long time exactly like himself. Not invisible, not forgotten. Not the man behind the wheel parked at a distance from a life that should have been his. Exactly, fully, completely himself. And that was everything.